Hello, welcome to our show, which is called The Story Matters, because every story does matter. Your story matters, mine, all of us. And it's good to explore with our friends the importance of story and what it means for us to have stories in our life and to share them with each other. So, our partner today in conversation is David Weinstock. David has been a teacher of poetry and storytelling for a long time. His existing group here at the library has gone for 20 years. And so, David, we'd like to invite you this morning to help us start the conversation.
Okay. When you asked me to do the storytelling workshop, because I've mostly taught writing rather than out loud storytelling, had to make a bit of an adjustment and try to figure out what's the difference between the one and the other. And the one thing is that you're personally out there. Your face, your body is in front of the audience. Writers can be introverts, writers can hide, writers can hole up in their rooms and their computers, but as a storyteller, you're right there in front of people. And that can be nervous making for people, and one thing that makes it easier is to pick a person that you want to talk to. One person, maybe someone who's actually in the room, maybe someone that you just like to tell stories to in your mind, and tell it to them. That way you don't have the sort of please all feeling.
Mm-hmm.
The
Who might be a story person that you would particularly remember? Do you come back to one person?
When I'm writing almost anything, I think I might be writing to myself as a reader or myself as a listener. I know what I like and the stories I would like to tell, and that I would like to hear. So I kind of tell him the stories. That's a little schizophrenic, but you know.
I sometimes think of Garrison Keillor. Garrison Keillor is my audience, and he's telling me how good I am. But never does happen. But it's I identify with what it means to tell your story to someone person.
Another thing that you need, because of this sort of personal exposure, is you need to feel like you have permission to tell the story. And some people feel like they're almost under oath. Some people feel like I don't want to embarrass my family. I don't want to embarrass my friends. I have to keep this one, on the harmless side.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have permission to tell this story, and that's very inhibiting. It might make you not tell the story at all, or it might make you tell the story badly. But it works a lot better to just say, look, it's my story. Even if other people are in it, it's my story. I can tell my story my way.
Mm-hmm.
And if that makes anybody nervous, they can tell their story their way when it's their turn. But you also should notice whether you are the storyteller in your family, whether you're the storyteller in your group. And it's very common in a family group that there'll be sort of a family-appointed story keeper, the person who knows the family stories.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have a storyteller in my family. When my family immigrated, they were done with the old world. They didn't want to tell stories about it at all. They were like, we left that behind.
Mm-hmm.
But they did tell jokes. And one of the things that I got was joke telling, mostly from my father, and he apparently got it from his mother. And how you tell a joke is a lot like how you should be telling a story. You should know what the punchline is in advance, and you should work toward it, and nothing should be in the story at all that doesn't move you toward that ending.
That's helpful.
Again, not everybody feels like they can tell jokes, but this is a way to.
Yeah, you and I've had that
it.
conversation about jokes, and I've learned from you about that. Because I don't tend to be a joke storyteller. At least I don't think, but it's helped me in being able to frame understand what my storytelling is all about. Your father was the jokester?
He was a joke teller. He told many jokes, and the way it almost always started was that he would say, something would come up in the conversation, and he would say, "That reminds me of," or here's what, and he would take a hook in the conversation and tell the joke. He didn't sit down and say, "I'm going to tell you jokes now." It was just something that happened in the course of the conversation. He used them almost like parables to explain human behavior.
Would the jokes then take you back into take him back into some of those experiences, or did the jokes take on the flavor of the new world?
I don't know where they came from. I mean, they were in English, so I think they were probably New York City. You know, that's where comedians came from, and that's where my father came from.
That's right.
So,
that's the city for it.
Yeah. I grew up in rural South Jersey, so far away from that, but I had New York parents.
Yeah.
What else can I tell you?
And you think he got the joke telling from his mother, your grandmother?
So I'm told, but I've never heard the story.
Okay.
And I don't. She didn't speak a whole lot of English, so I don't know where it came from exactly. But he was a joke teller, to the point that, and some people don't like jokes, and some people don't like dirty jokes. I remember a friend of mine in college, whose father worked in the same field as my father. When he heard that my father was moving to Australia, he said, "Oh well, no more of those jokes." So, I was going to tell you.
So that really helps, be able to. And you enjoy telling jokes?
I do, and they're almost always in the realm of that reminds me of. You know, somebody says something about whatever, and you lead into the joke from that. And you want to get right to the thing. You don't ramble. That's the thing. And I think what ruins a lot of storytelling, informal storytelling or storytelling in the group, is rambling. Is someone telling all the background but never the action. And if there's no action, it's nice. It's like a tone poem, but it's not a story. And what people remember about a story is this thing that happened. So there was a conflict, there was a fight, there was an accident, there was a catastrophe, or there was a laugh. And so when you tell stories, even though they don't have to be jokes exactly, with punchlines exactly, they have to have something they're going toward. Now, you may not know what they're going toward until you've told the story a few times. That's one of the things about writing and storytelling, is that you should start and see where it takes you. You don't have to have it all planned out, but eventually, as you tell the story again and again, you'll know what the funny parts are. You know where people laugh. You'll know when people gasp.
Yeah.
You know, when they look nervous. And
so you keep trying, so it may come out differently, and then that becomes the process by which you say, that fits. No, that doesn't fit. Yeah.
Yeah, or that's off on the side.
Yeah.
You know, if you see one thing about storytelling that's different from writing is that the people reacting to you are right in front of you. They may laugh in places you didn't know were funny. And they may look bored in places you didn't think were boring. That's instructive for you to change the story and leave out that stuff, or put it in a different way.
How is this? How is it different for storytelling as related to poetry? Are there different sets of rules or expectations there?
For me, as a modern American free verse poet,
Right.
it's not as different as you might think. If I were in a different era where I was writing rhymed verse or sestinas or couplets, or it would be a special voice. And sometimes at a poetry reading, you'll hear people kind of go into their poetry voice. They get all sorts of sort of British and dramatic. But modern American poetry almost always uses the conversational, uses the colloquial voice, way of talking about things, structures and rhythms. And to me, that's the most natural thing. Now, it's true that there are times when you want a kind of a special atmosphere for a story. Like when I say to you, once upon a time, you know to switch into that story listening mode. You know that whatever follows is going to be a story, once upon a time. With my older son, when I was bringing him up, I would tell him stories every night. And the stories all started like this. Once upon a time, there was a little boy who lived in Vermont, who lived in a big white house in Vermont with his mommy and his daddy and his little brother Danny and a cat named Moose and 99 stuffed animals. And that's how it would start every single time, and it could go anywhere. But that was a way to say, okay, here comes the story, quiet, here you go.
Okay.
And that made a sort of magical spell for Dad. And it was very different because the other son was different, and I told him different kinds of stories. And those stories were about what we called the Magic Sidewalk. Every day, the story would be about walking to school on the little sidewalk that runs up the back of Buttolph Acres to Mary Hogan School. And something would always happen on the Magic Sidewalk. Some magical toy or something would show up. And Danny, who's very mathematical, would say, well, I can't just have one. I need 24 of these because there's the kids in my class, and there's the teacher, and there's the aides. and so the Magic Sidewalk would create 24 of whatever it was. And that was always, and there were different ways the story would go, but there was always that element of being on the Magic Sidewalk and the Magic Sidewalk doing its magic to make there be enough of the magical thing for everyone in the story.
Did you write these as a writer? Did you write these?
No, those were completely oral and verbal.
Okay.
Not. In fact, when I for notes on today, I tried to remember exactly the Ben one. I had to look it up because I hadn't said it in a while. But I think I put it in an email to him when he was in college. I said, "Oh, here's this thing I used to say to you." There's a lot of ways people signal that a story is happening. Sometimes it's a different tone of voice. Sometimes it's a way of sitting. But it puts a fence around the poem or it makes a different world. And that's the thing about a story, is that it's in a different world. And because it's in a different world, there are different rules. And one of the rules can be, it doesn't have to be strictly true. You can, if the 3 important things happened on 3 different days, but you want them all to happen on one day, you can do that.
Sure.
If they happened to someone else, not to you, you can put them in. If someone didn't say quite the right thing, you can fix it up. You're not under oath, I guess, is what I'm saying. And
although one of the things when you hear people talk about storytelling, they say they particularly say it needs to be a true story. But
the Moth Storytelling podcast has a rule that the stories are true as remembered and affirmed by the storyteller.
Okay.
So I know I've listened to Moth stories that couldn't exactly be true, but they're true enough to tell.
Right.
So there aren't outright fictions there, but they tidy things up, and that's a courtesy to the listener. But it's also, you're only the first teller of the story. If it's a good story, it's going to get retold by someone else for years, centuries, thousands of years.
That old adage, all stories are true and some of them actually happened.
Yeah. And stories are really powerful. When you think about sort of the history of the world, the history of religion, that story, about Moses, that story about Abraham, that story about Jesus, we know them as stories, and getting those stories exactly right and getting them told over thousands of years. It's an amazing thing.
Mm-hmm.
Those wouldn't have been as powerful as they were if they weren't stories, if they were just a catalog of facts, if they were boring history. But no, they're lively stories with characters, with not a whole lot of jokes, but interesting things happen, and it's powerful.
I had some times when I was younger, when I was really cautious about stories, because my mother would use the phrase, "Are you telling a story?" She didn't want to come out and say, "I think you're lying," or she might use, "Are you fibbing?"
Mm-hmm.
You know. But when she used the phrase "stories," it began to imply, at least in that one age, that I wasn't really telling the truth. You know, I was lying to her, and she wanted, and I had been found out. You know, and discovered.
There's a character in the Harry Potter stories, Uncle Dudley, not Uncle Dudley, Uncle Vernon, who very much is against the imagination. He doesn't want anyone to imagine anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so when people tell stories, he wants them to be true. He doesn't want to hear what someone dreamed about. He doesn't want to hear someone speculate about. And you don't want that person in your audience, but
No.
you know, if you tell them a story, you should tell it as true, no matter how perfectly true it is.
Yeah, yeah. So do you enjoy being a performer of telling stories?
It's not my natural bent. I can read my poetry very easily in front of other people, and a lot of poets can't. But I do enjoy it. And one reason that I enjoy it is that most of what I write is in some way funny. Poetry readings are kind of a ghastly affair. Serious poems, someone will read something and the listeners will have a little inhale or they'll gasp or they'll, but mostly it's a very silent activity. And but if your poem is funny or if your story is funny, they know what to do. They laugh. They laugh in certain places, and that relaxes them. That lets them know what to do. So I like to at least start with something funny or end with something funny because it gets the audience connected, and it takes the burden off them. Sometimes in a small poetry audience, everybody feels like they're on stage. So giving them something to do works better.
Well, in part is that sometimes the way poetry readings are depicted in movies. How would you? What would be your thought about that? They tend to be what?
Fancy, pretentious, boring. It's not a genre that translates well to film, I guess I'd say. I mean, I'm glad that it is done so personally in small rooms with 40 folding chairs that are half filled, and nobody sits on the front row. It's but for some poets do connect well with the audience. Other poets are so text oriented that they can't really. Another thing that happens is that somebody will read a poem and you go, okay, that's the poem. And then they'll talk about the poem afterwards. They'll sort of explain it. And sometimes the explanation is much better than the poem. And that's always interesting to me. If I have one of those people as a student, I'll say, how about if we get some of that cool stuff into the poem instead of having it just be a footnote? Because of people's feeling that the poem or the story is some kind of sacred territory where you can't quite really say what you mean because that would be so obvious. Poets are a little afraid of being obvious. And storytellers have less of that problem, but still, it's good to just tell the story the way you would tell it in English to whoever's listening.
I remember the person who helped me get over my mother's caution about stories was an, I think she was an aunt, but I don't know. She was connected to the family in some way. But she was, as I was a teenager, she opened me up to the world of raucous stories. And I thought, oh my gosh, there's more to this than Sunday school stories. There's more to life than fairy tales. And so she kind of rescued me for stories, you know, because she was funny.
I bet she had a reputation in the family.
She did. She was. My mother was. My mother liked her a lot, but usually she got going when my mother was not in the room. When my mother was someplace else, you know. So I'll always be indebted to her for that.
Yeah, you know. And that's a matter of permission.
Yeah, that's right. Permission.
You know, permission to be funny, permission to be interesting, permission to tell stories that aren't right for Sunday school.
Yeah, that's right.
Sunday school probably could be more interesting too, but that's not my business.
No. There was another woman who was on the flip side of that. She told those biblical and mission stories in a way that was that had life to it, you know, and energy and made me want to go to India or someplace like that, and so there was adventure in the whole thing. So those two women, I think, sort of played a big role in my life. So how do you encourage people then to tell us? If you were to say to people, you really need to I want to encourage you to tell your story. And what would you say to them or help them do that?
I'll give prompts to try to make them remember. One of them is, what's the worst thing that ever happened to you? What's the best birthday you ever had? Which other life would you have wanted to have if you had a different life? When did everything change for you is another one. So when people tell personal stories, they focusing on a turning point, focusing on a moment where they had a realization or an epiphany or something happened where they said, oh, all right, I should move to New York City and be a comedian, or I should stop drinking or start drinking or whatever. So I like to get people to, and it doesn't have to be the most important thing that ever happened to you. It's the most important story you can tell, the most interesting story you could tell. So what's the worst thing that ever happened to you is something that everybody knows the answer to. Tell me about that day. And although that sounds very sort of depressing, when I tell the story about my father dying and flying out to Houston to sort of claim his body, when I tell the story, there's a lot of funny bits in it. I had a fantasy that he hadn't died at all, that I knew that he had lost his wallet at some point. And what I kind of thought was that someone else had died carrying his ID, and they just made a mistake. So I was thinking, oh, I'm going to go there, and they're going to say, oh, never mind, it wasn't your father. Go back to Vermont. But what happened was that I was in the Houston airport, sort of walking across the plaza, and the funeral director saw me and said, "You sure do favor your daddy, don't you?" Meaning, you resemble the deceased.
Yeah.
And that took me out of that.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh my.
Take the worst day of your life. What was the best thing that happened that day, or what's the story you want to tell from that?
Mm-hmm.
How are we doing on time? Yeah. What else can I tell you?
Are the stories that you'd like to tell, or jokes? You got it?
We have time?
Sure, we do.
Forgive me for looking at notes because I haven't memorized this one, but
All right.
My friend Charlie collected relics, mostly by stealing them. Always very small things, too small to be missed. Once he was in the Air and Space Museum in Washington before they renovated it, and the Enola Gay, the bomber that dropped the Hiroshima bomb, was there, and he reached up and he took a little piece of the gasketing off the fuselage, just a tiny scrap, and he kept that as a souvenir. Another time he was working at Harvard Library, where they had Emily Dickinson's books and her desk, and they had a little recreation of her office. And he opened the desk drawer one day. He was the guard. He could move her, and there was a little collection of little bits of paper, like stuff that had broken off her letters or her poems, like sacred confetti. And he just kind of swept it up into a bag and kept it for years. So when I married Anne, Charlie gave her a little tiny piece of brick, a sort of cranberry shape and size and color. And he said that this was a piece of brick from the Cambridge jail where the Salem witches were kept before they were hanged. And one of these witches was an ancestor of my wife's. So he gave her this sacred relic of her family. He had a fairly miserable life, and he wanted so much, and he had so little. One day I was in Cape Cod at Marconi Station, and I found a couple of really nice stones, nice rocks, just sort of sea-polished rocks, little round ones. And I picked them up, and I said, I'm going to give these to Charlie when I see him next time. And this would be really important to him because it was Marconi Beach, and Charlie was kind of a tinkerer. He held inventors much higher than any other kind of saint, and he wanted to be someone who invented things, a self-educated tinkerer. And I ran into him on the street, and I reached in my backpack, and I took the stones out of it, and I handed them to him, and I told him where they were from, and he held them in his hands, and he closed his eyes, and he said, uploading. I really like that. He was, well, okay. See, now, as a storyteller, I should stop right there.
Yeah.
I shouldn't explain it. I shouldn't tell any more about it, but uploading.
That's a great line. I think we've had a great time.
Okay,
I
thank you.
thoroughly enjoyed this, and we thank you for coming and having this conversation, and we're grateful that you're doing, and that you're encouraging people to claim their story.
Thank you.
And so thank you, David.
Thanks for having me.
Okay.